I'm Joan Thompson, and I want to extend a very warm welcome to everyone joining us for the first of our fall climate webinars. Whether this is your first time or your 40th, we're glad you're with us, and we're very thankful for your willingness to learn and explore more about climate realities. Under our overarching vision of the flourishing of life for all, we've looked at some science, political action, consumer and lifestyle choices, social justice, eco-justice, racism, and unfolding global disasters over the past 2 years of webinars. Much of our emphasis, as well as that of the media, has been on minimizing the amount of carbon and methane going into our atmosphere. But there's more to climate action than mitigation. Next slide, please. Absolutely, reducing carbon emissions is the first vital step. The faster and deeper emissions can be cut, the less extreme the future impact. But when it comes to climate and the environment, there's a time lag between action and result. Even if global emissions were to fall to zero overnight, changes already triggered will continue to play out over the next decades and centuries. While we're focused on greening our energy grid and capping emissions, we also need to look at actions to take now to prepare for current and upcoming new realities. One of the foundations for this team is the 5-step formula laid out by Community of Christ President Stephen Veazey in an October 2020 sermon, the first 2 steps of which are displayed here. A prophetic people must accurately discern true realities that may not be apparent to others, or realities they may not want to face. And 2, a prophetic people envision an alternative future in harmony with God's nature and purposes for creation. If we want to be a prophetic people, then we start by taking a long look at the real. It's human nature to think that climate disasters will happen in the future, and hopefully the distant future, and that they'll happen somewhere else and to someone else. We might think we'll need to make some minor changes, but we hope that our lives will continue pretty much the same. We've likely not thought a lot about what changes are coming to our campgrounds. For many of us, these are sacred spaces that we love and cherish, and we want them to be there for our children and grandchildren so that they too can experience sacred community in life-transforming and enriching ways. But chances are that changes have already been happening at your campgrounds, whether they're yet visible or not. And there will certainly be more to come. Today, our focus is on accurately discerning some of those true realities, whether they're ones we want to face or not. By our count, there are currently 38 Community of Christ campgrounds in North America, and we believe that every single one of them is at risk. Then next week, in our September 25th conversation, we want to look at actions. What are the actions we need to start taking to adapt our sacred spaces to these new realities? But we want to go further than just adapting. Step 2 in President Veazey's formula about envisioning an alternate future, one that is in harmony with God's nature and purpose for creation. What's the highest vision we can imagine for our sacred campgrounds? Then, how might we pray, plan, and act in hope to include securing the well-being of the most vulnerable as part of our campground visioning? President Veazey has also called the Church to envision and implement new forms of ministry, ones that promote Christ's mission of peace and justice. Our campgrounds typically have more resources than individual campgrounds. They have more land, more people, and more physical resources. What new forms of ministry might we envision for these sacred spaces? So we turn now to look at what is coming. As we go along, put any comments or questions in the chat. We'll do our best to answer questions either today or next Sunday. Our team has been busy researching. Paul will begin by looking at some of the realities for the Western mountain grounds, using Buckhorn as an example. Dean will then explore the sea level realities for Samish Campground in the Greater Pacific Northwest and other coastal grounds. I'll talk about some of the realities for northern and eastern inland sites. We'll have some time for you to share with us around your sacred spaces. Then Laurie will close us with a few thoughts towards imagining and discerning actions towards a new future for these sacred spaces. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Joan. Let me Okay, can I get a thumbs up if you see 2 feet? Okay. In both the 7th chapter of Acts and the 3rd chapter of Exodus, the scriptures describe a reverence for the sacred. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. So when were you last on holy ground? Was it in a place of wilderness, a place of undisturbed grandeur, a place left to be used by all creatures? Wilderness can deepen our appreciation of creation, can deepen our humility, can allow us to discern our place in God's creation. In the 5th chapter of Luke, Jesus withdrew to the wilderness and prayed. It can make us feel closer to God. For many of us, our memories of holy ground take us back to experiences at church camps and to wonders found only at campgrounds. A search of Community of Christ campgrounds reveal many situated in forest areas, in some cases, heavily forested areas. Camp Remote in Oregon, Big Spruce in Colorado, Whispering Pines in Arizona, Happy Valley in Northern California, and Buckhorn in Southern California. I want to pause here to acknowledge the ancestral unceded territory of the Cahuilla First Peoples, the original people of the land on which our Camp Buckhorn resides, the land which we and they consider sacred. Now, if we pull back the view of this campground, you can see that same camp circled in red. And for reference, the camp is situated on Highway 243, just to the east of a sharp switchback in the road. And you can use that switchback as a visual reference when looking at maps of the area. In the western states, due to prolonged drought and more frequent heat extremes, wildfire risk is more and more of a concern. In the case of Buckhorn Camp in the Pacific Southwest International Mission Center, there have been 3 major fire evacuations in recent memory. The July 1996 Bee Canyon fire, considered small, as it burned less than 10,000 acres, was perhaps the closest one to ever come to our campgrounds. The CAL FIRE incident report, dated July 1st, states that the fire was burning just 2 miles to the west of Idlewild, which would be just a few miles south of Camp Buckhorn. The towns of Idlewild, just south of us, and Pine Cove, just north of us, were both evacuated. CNN reported the evacuation was lifted on July 4th for residents, although it was still off limits to the general public, and all campgrounds remained closed. So the town of Idlewild is just to the right of the yellow area described in the incident report. Buckhorn is only a few miles to the northwest of the fire in red. The 2013 mountain fire burned nearly 30,000 acres. It burned for 2 weeks, also in July. The fire started south of Idlewild and headed east, but the town was evacuated anyway. Ron Norton, who was the camp director at the time, recalls having 350 campers on site when the evacuation orders came through. You can see that switchback in the road in the upper left-hand corner showing where the camp is in relation to the burn area. The camp had a contract with Hemet Valley School District, and they sent 8 buses up the mountain to evacuate the campers. Ron remembers the thick smoke visible to the east and ash falling on the campgrounds. You can just imagine the range of emotions felt by those campers, seeing the glow and the smoke of the fire and waiting for evacuation as ash falls like bad snow all around you. The 2018 Cranston fire triggered evacuations in both Idlewild and Pine Cove again, the towns just north and south of the camp. Again, you can see by the switchback in the highway, by the red check in the top, the proximity of the camp to the fire zone. While the fire never reached the town of Idlewild, it did impact some remote residential areas and several homes were destroyed. Now, I don't have as much information about this one, but we did have a close call at the Sierra Pacific Mission Center's Happy Valley Campgrounds from the 2020 CZU fire. That fire burned for over a month, started by a flurry of lightning strikes. The CZU fire burned nearly 90,000 acres, destroying 1,500 buildings and most of the neighborhoods of Boulder Creek, Bonnie Doon, and Swanton. So while the 3 fires that affected Buckhorn, these were the larger fires that triggered evacuations. The list of recorded fire incidents in the San Jacinto Ranger District, where Buckhorn is located, is chilling. It isn't that there were only 3 fires in the area. There were only 3 in the immediate area that went rogue. Fires pop up several times nearly every year. The traditional fire season is starting earlier and lasting longer due to climate change. In fact, over the recent Labor Day weekend, there were 90 notable fires burning in the western states. Even as I was compiling this report, the Fairview fire that started on the Monday of Labor Day was burning a scant 15 miles from Camp Buckhorn. And at that time, the day after, they had 2 fatalities, and the burn area grew from 2,400 acres after the first day to nearly 30,000 acres on Friday, cutting the distance between between the fire and Camp Buckhorn in about half. Luckily, Hurricane K made a pass close to Southern California on Friday. That was the 9th, and brought some slow, steady rain that helped slow the fire's advance without creating mudslides or generating high winds in the fire area. But even if one escapes the actual fire, there are added dangers from smoke and particulate matter thrown into the air, and that's the air that we breathe. Smoke and ash can travel miles ahead of the fire. In this case, it's nearly 100 miles from where the fire broke out to the city of Barstow at the top of the picture in red. The small particulate matter from the smoke and ash that we unknowingly inhale deep into our lungs can cause permanent damage or aggravate existing lung and heart issues. In addition to the devastation the fire causes, the obvious health risks from smoke and particulate inhalation, there are even more hidden damages. NPR reports people who face natural disasters frequently struggle with mental health problems. In addition to facing the threat of property loss or even death, fire and fire threat, the panic of evacuation, and simply the fearful anticipation of a nearing fire can lead to depression, anxiety, and PTSD. Another lasting danger are the thousands of gallons of chemical retardants spread on thousands of acres. Although wildfire retardants are supposed to be safe for humans, many suggest the risks are not well understood. In 2011, the Forest Service published an environmental impact study concluding that aerial retardant posed minimal risk to most birds and larger wildlife like bear and deer because they're able to flee the fire areas. The report admits that there is a higher risk to animal species that remain behind, amphibians, rodents, insects unable to travel distances. The study also concludes the retardants could adversely affect water quality lingering for 2 years or more. Beyond that, prolonged droughts and more frequent heat extremes due to climate change stress and weaken plants and trees, leaving them susceptible to insect and disease damage. Again, in the case of buckhorn camp, drought has allowed the bark beetle to wreak havoc on the pine tree population in the San Jacinto Mountains, killing thousands upon thousands of trees. A healthy tree would simply pitch out beetles by drowning the larvae in sap. Drought-weakened trees simply don't have the sap, so that the beetles run rampant, killing the host tree. It also caused an explosion in the beetle population in the mountains. Ron Norton, the camp manager we previously heard from, said when he started in 2001, buckhorn had lost approximately 900 pine trees. By the time he retired in 2018, he estimated the total was over 3,000 trees lost. Across California, the past decade has seen over 1 million pine trees die every year. The loss of trees, deaths of trees exacerbates the fire danger and creates the need for expensive tree removal. The tree loss also increases the dangers of mudslides and flooding. Climate change can affect rain patterns, causing in some areas fewer but more intense rain events, lessening the ability of the land to benefit from the precipitation. If you recall the map of the Buckhorn area, there's only one highway. You either go north or south on Highway 243 to come or leave the camp. On Valentine's Day in 2019, unusually heavy rains caused extensive flooding and washes in the area. North of the camp, the highway was damaged by raging floodwaters in 35 different places. One, a critical washout of the highway. The route to or from the camp was cut by 50%, as the route north was closed for nearly the rest of the year. The climate issues facing buckhorn may not affect all our campgrounds, but it is probable that at least the ones in the western states have similar issues. All are reeling from the effects of prolonged drought and excessive heat events. Beyond climate issues, many camps have an economic model that requires outside rental funds to help operate the camp, and COVID restrictions are sure to have financially impacted most camps. Many of our sacred spaces are facing challenges. We are between what was and what will be. So how can our sacred spaces be a blessing to future generations and all creation? How will we honor our sacred spaces? Next, Dean White will share stories of some more campgrounds. Dean, do you want to take it away? And don't forget to unmute.
Just one moment while I get it brought up.
I'm still seeing Paul's slide. Do we need to have his slides come down for yours to come up, Dean?
Yeah, I think so. I've got his screen and I can't, with it up, I can't see my controls.
How's that?
Yep, that's better. Are people able to see my first slide here?
Yes.
Great. So Paul's presentation might lead one to believe that the line from the Carter family song, God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, but the fire next time. We may wish in the face of wildfire and drought that we might at least enjoy calm seas and reliable shores. Unfortunately, climate change is affecting many aspects of our world, not the least of which are sea level rise and other flooding from severe weather events. Though I wish my granddaughter could indeed command the seas to recede, it's not in the cards. So my section will talk about the threat of sea level rise and related flood hazards on our sacred reunion campground spaces. We'll start with our beloved campground serving several states in the southeast of the United States. It's known as the Bluff Springs Campground in Northeast Florida, near the Alabama border and serving at least 3 mission centers. The campground is 35 miles north of Pensacola, Florida, and 3.5 miles from the Escambia River, which is subject to storm surges and vulnerable to extreme high tides, particularly as sea levels rise. Bluff Springs is on a beautiful man-made lake at the head of a stream that runs into the Escambia River. And here's a view of the lake and the campgrounds from above. And here's the same area as shown on a flood hazard projection map produced by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, or often referred to simply as NOAA. And finally, here's how NOAA represents the risk to the area from flooding under extreme weather conditions, such as the heavy rainstorm events experienced recently in the Southeast and elsewhere. That will only get worse as sea levels rise and hold floodwaters back from draining. Another beloved and sacred campground is New England's Onset Campground, located at the entrance to Cape Cod in Massachusetts. Boston is to the north, and Providence, Rhode Island, to the west. Onset is on a saltwater cove on the east side, with cranberry bogs to its west. The campground is accessed from two roads. From the south, Camp Street at the bottom of this image, and Zarahemla Road from the bottom left. I wonder where they got that name. The tabernacle is on a small hill circled in red, an RV area in green, and private and rental cottages in the blue area. In this image, the areas in red are those areas subject to high tide flooding without any sea level rise. And you'll see Camp Street is cut off, and Zarahemla Road is the only access. This shows the impact of a 1-foot sea level rise, which means at the mean or average high tide level. And by the way, experts agree that 1 foot of sea level rise is already inevitable. With 1 foot sea level rise, Camp Street is at risk of being flooded routinely, as is the green area, and water encroaches to the backyards of the private cottages from the east. With a 3-foot sea level rise, Camp Street access is closed. At 5 feet sea level rise, access to Onset Campground is no longer possible by road, and the water has flooded some cottages. Of course, extreme or king tides will encroach on cottages even more, making them likely not able to be used. At 10 feet, which could occur into the closing decades of this century, the camping area is inundated and the tabernacle is separated from the cottage area. A composite with the flooding, all the flooding hazards projected by NOAA, including sea level rise, storm surges, extreme flooding from weather, etc. And in the entire area, it impacts the entire area in and around the Onset Campground. An internationally beloved Community of Christ campground is Tiona Holiday Park on the eastern coast of Australia, 125 miles north of Sydney. Purchased by the church in 1923, at one time it held reunions attended by more than 700 people. It is located on a strip of coast with the sea on the east and a saltwater lake or inlet on the west. The grounds are famous for many features, including the Green Cathedral and a wedding and events center. It's managed for the church by a private firm. At current high tides, the wedding and events center is often impacted, and water encircles the gathering place on 3 sides. With sea level rise of 0.84 meters, just under 3 feet, which is considered likely by at least 2100. The wedding and event center is unusable, and mean high tides are lapping at the buildings used for reunions. A 2-meter rise in the high tide average, or just over 6 feet, would completely inundate the coastal strip and turn it into a series of small islands. Finally, I want to focus on a campground near and dear to the hearts and souls of those of us who live in British Columbia and Washington and other nearby states, and others who either visited or come from afar. Samish Island is sacred to two peoples, at least, members and friends of 3 mission centers of the Community of Christ, but historically for a much longer time to the Samish tribe and other indigenous Coast Salish peoples, including Lummi, Swinomish, Nisqually, and Nooksack, to name a few. What's more, it's at the center of an endangered ecosystem for many species: salmon, shellfish, orca, eagles, and other birds, and of course, others, us as humans. Now, we'll talk more about that in our session a week from today, which we hope you'll return to, where we begin to discuss how our use of sacred space might help to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change. But for the moment, I just want to share what's made Samish Island sacred and what the impacts may be of sea level rise in particular. Samish Island is a part of the Salish Sea, which includes inland waters in Washington and British Columbia. It's fed by the waters of the Fraser, Nooksack, Skagit, Snohomish, and many other rivers. On this map, it's in the circled area east of the San Juan Islands, south of Vancouver, BC, and north of the towns of Mount Vernon and Burlington. A closer view shows its proximity to Bellingham, where I live, to Anacortes, which is a beautiful town, but also home to a very large oil refinery, and of course the San Juan Islands, for which Friday Harbor is the principal town. The campground area is encircled in this view. As you can see, the island is connected to the mainland by a stretch of land reclaimed and protected by a series of levees. As these images demonstrate, the campground's beauty and its activities contribute to its sacredness. Of particular importance has been the annual Salmon Dinner, which has been a church community tradition for decades, about which you'll again hear more later if you return for next Sunday's session on the 25th. As I said, the Samish Island, circled in blue, is also sacred to the Samish tribe and other Coast Salish peoples. The island is at the eastern edge of the traditional lands of the Samish peoples, which encompass virtually all of the San Juan Islands. One can imagine members of the Samish people enjoying this same awesome sunsets we enjoy looking north toward Lummi Island, part of the Lummi tribe traditional lands. And so too do the Salish people feast on salmon at community gatherings, and the many species of salmon are central to the culture of the Coast Salish people. While we enjoy the beauty and the variety of shells we gather on the island's beaches, these creatures have also been the main food source for the indigenous cultures of the Salish Sea. Samish people occupied eastern Samish Island at the time of European colonization in a village shown by the red marker called Atsikin. The church campground property is circled in green. Samish people were respected for their spiritual strength as well as their skillful carving of canoes and construction of longhouses. One of those longhouses on the eastern end of Samish Island measured several hundred feet, with some documents reporting it to be as long as 1,250 feet. In 1847, the tribe had over 2,000 members. 12 years later, at the time of the Treaty of Point Elliott negotiations, raids from northern tribes and epidemics of measles, smallpox, tuberculosis, and influenza had decreased the Samish population to about 150. Documents show 113 Samish were present in Mukilteo, at the time of the Point Elliott Treaty signing in 1855. Many of the Samish people refused to stay on reservations after the Treaty of Port Elliott was signed. They remained at the Samish Island village during the winters and followed traditional harvest canoe routes through the islands in the spring and summer. Today, tribal members still celebrate their canoe prowess, but in the mid-1870s, when the Samish people left in canoes for seasonal harvest in the islands to gather food, the planks and beams of the longhouse at Eken on Samish Island were taken by European settlers. After the longhouse was dismantled by the settlers, many Samish moved to a new village on Güemes Island to the west. A few Samish people continued to live on Samish Island, including Holton, called by the settlers Harry Samish, and his daughter Annie Lyons. In recent years, the Samish tribe has reinterred the remains of many tribal members into a graveyard on what is now the church campgrounds. The graveyard is at the northern end of the fence line in this 1915 plat map, near what is labeled the Indian's Garden, where fruit trees, berries, and beans were planted. Because of this history, it's important that we acknowledge the historical occupants of the land the campgrounds now occupy. We who enjoy the Samish campground acknowledge we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Samish people. The Samish people are the original inhabitants of the islands of the Southern Salish Sea. They live in villages throughout this territory, including Eastern Samish Island, and continue to have an ongoing relationship with these areas. Since time immemorial, they have celebrated life on their land, their waterways, and on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of their people to perpetuate their way of life. Please join us in taking a moment of silence as we honor their ancestors and as we acknowledge the past, present, and future Samish people as the original inhabitants of this island, this land. It's also important that we nurture our relationship with the current Samish Indian Nation and other Coast Salish peoples, and we'll explore those opportunities in our session next week. As you'll see now, we share a common threat to this sacred ground. The NOAA image, again, shows Samish Island and the campground in relation to the connecting mainland area. With a 1 foot increase in mean high sea level, a small spit of land just across the bay from the campground, and the entire green area is put at risk of flooding from extreme tides and excessive rain events. Now remember, a 1 foot increase in sea level is now inevitable from the results of global warming. A 2 foot sea level rise inundates the entire area south and east of Samish Island to a distance of about 3 miles. Without massive mitigation efforts, raising levees, and other measures, Samish Island again becomes a true island at high tides and surrounded by mudflats at other times. A 5 foot sea level increase, at that level, its existence as a true island, inaccessible by land, becomes assured. Melting glacial and ice shelf ice from global temperatures increasing above 2 degrees centigrade assures at least this level of sea rise. Man-made Freestad Lake, the baptismal spot and swimming hole for the Samish Island campground, will return to the sea as at least a tidal mudflat. Images such as this will be a thing of the past for all who hold these grounds sacred. And now I'm going to pass it over to Joan, and I'm going to bring up her slide deck. Once again, I lost my place to share my screen. Here we are. Joan, can you see this screen?
I can. Thank you so much, Dean. So our coastal properties are all at varying levels of risk with rising sea levels and the storm surge increase that comes with it. Western properties are all increasingly at risk with heat and drought, which leads to tree canopy loss, fires, and then mudslides. What about all the inland campgrounds? Will we get off more easily? Rather than look at individual campgrounds, we turn now to identifying the major changes happening everywhere in North America. The Intact Center for Climate Adaptation has labeled climate change as a contagion. I didn't understand that when I first heard it in a pre-COVID-19 world, but now I see what was being inferred by this term. We watched in early 2020 as the virus went from a few people in China to the whole country, and then Italy, and then Seattle, and New York, and then everywhere. Since then, we've all lost people, and there's not a single person whose life hasn't been impacted and changed by the global spread of this constantly changing virus. It changes everything, everywhere. And that's what's happening with climate change. As the president of Pakistan said in his call for global aid in a time of unprecedented flooding, my country today, your country tomorrow. We're all in this together. The term used to sum up what we can expect is hotter, wetter, wilder. The major events we will likely all face are extreme heat, a combination of drought and flood, fire and wind. While we're all well aware by now of extreme heat events, I want to take a brief look at the impact of heat and drought on tree canopy, then look at what is meant by wetter and wilder. Paul talked about the steady tree loss occurring in the west and the south. But let's also look north to the boreal forest. It circles the globe just south of the Arctic Circle, with about 1/3 of it in North America and 2/3 in Northern Europe and Scandinavia. It accounts for 1/3 of the total global forested area, and it's crucial to the health of all life that it remains healthy. But in fact, huge changes are happening here as well. This map from CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, shows satellite imagery of what's been happening over the last decade or so. The brown dots show areas where the trees are dying or have died, but they're still standing. Black areas are where the trees have disappeared entirely. Green dots show areas of new growth further north. Some have said that the boreal forest is simply migrating north, not dying. And over hundreds of years, that may in fact be the end result. But in the meantime, scientists now say that the southern part of the boreal forest will soon become prairies. They know the order of events. First, the spruce die, then the pine, and then the aspen. As temperatures climb in the Arctic and the permafrost comes out of the tundra, trees do begin growing further north. However, it will take hundreds of years for these areas of new growth to become mature forest. The scenario Paul described with pine trees dying in California as a result of stress from heat and drought that leads to infestation is not limited to California, and it's not limited to pine trees. It's happening in the north, and it's happening everywhere. Take a good look at the forests around where you live and at the tree canopy in and around your campgrounds. At Ontario in southwest Ontario, we're noticing this year for the first time an alarming increase in dead and dying cedar trees. It's one of the first types of trees south of the boreal forest to be dying off. The combination of drought and dead trees is increasing fire risk almost everywhere. In northern Ontario, a huge area within which Camp Naronto is located, both the number and size of forest fires are increasing, with last year having twice the 10-year average. This map shows the fires raging on one day in early July of last year. Areas around the camp have been evacuated twice in the last 4 years. So we've put together a spreadsheet of the specific campground risks we've become aware of. If your campground is not on the list, it's just because we're not personally aware of your climate realities. There are already many campgrounds that are at or moving into a high-risk category. So what can we do? First, we need to learn as much as we can about what's happening now and what's projected to happen in our local areas. We need to talk with conservation groups and government groups and Indigenous groups to get the best information on steps we can take to conserve and protect existing trees, as well as recommendations for what trees to plant now that are most resilient to climate change and most suitable for the climate we will have in the future. We also need to look at what we can do to minimize fire risk to our grounds and buildings. Remember the wetter part of the slogan, hotter, wetter, wilder? If so many parts of the continent are experiencing severe drought, how does it get wetter? And why is flooding such a big risk? The answer is that as the climate patterns shift and more moisture is pulled out of the ground into the atmosphere, much of the rain we're getting is coming in downpours, infrequent downpours at that tend to run off from the hard ground and then overflow lakes and rivers or back up storm reservoirs. This graph shows the percent increase in how much water is falling in single heavy rain events. So if you're in the Northeast and Atlantic provinces, a single storm may bring down almost twice as much water as it did 60 years ago. And in the past few years, we've seen rain bombs or rain cyclones or microbursts in many places, including Atlantic Canada, British Columbia, Louisiana, New York, Houston, and as this picture shows, Arizona. In a suburb of Toronto, there were almost 500,000 homes flooded in 1 hour by a microburst, while neighboring suburbs received no rain at all. There aren't yet tools to predict when and where they'll hit. Freshwater flooding is happening more frequently and covering large areas. Our current landscaping and our current infrastructure just weren't designed to handle these volumes of water. The good news is that there are strategies in modifying grading and landscaping and retrofitting buildings to minimize the potential impact of these storms. Which brings us to the wilder part. We know that hurricanes and tropical storms are increasing in number, size, and strength. The stronger and faster the storm is moving, the further inland hurricane force winds will be felt, and the further inland rain and flooding will happen. We also know that tornado patterns are shifting. This USA Today graphic shows the shift eastward. Basically, if you're east of the Rocky Mountains, you are now in a possible tornado zone. And it doesn't stop at the border. It just doesn't show it. Eastern Canada was caught unprepared this spring with a derecho, and no idea how you pronounce that, bringing hurricane-strength rain and wind along a path 1,000 kilometers long, which is 620 miles, lasting over a period of 8 hours, taking down trees and power lines as it went, causing flooding and huge amounts of damage. This path came close to 3 of our campgrounds. Where we live, 5 minutes before it reached us, it was a beautiful day. 5 minutes after it passed, we were out assessing the damage. But it's not just traditional storms. This report from the Maine Monitor reports on research showing that in most areas, winds have become 6% stronger overall over the last decade. What about your campgrounds and sacred spaces? Let's take a good look and investigate what signs of change may already be there. The people that have been doing the most extensive research into the changing trends are the insurance industry. This graphic from Swiss Re, a global reinsurance company, is a few years out of date, but shows the steadily increasing global loss from catastrophes, shown in billions of US dollars, with weather-related catastrophes shown in green, driving the increase. Within Community of Christ, today's worship theme is Practice Faithful Stewardship. In a world where we're being urged to build climate and disaster resilience, what might responsible stewardship for sacred spaces look like? And now over to you, Paul. Oh, Brad. Sorry.
Thanks, Jen. So as we have seen and been reminded of, many of us who have grown up in the reunion and camping tradition of Community of Christ and other churches, that these are sacred places for us. These are special places. These are places where we connect to the divine in unique and wonderful ways in community. And we've been reminded of that, but we've also seen that these places are under threat. These places that we cherish, that we love, that bless us, could be devastated in different ways: fires, flooding, tornadoes, winds. So I do want to remind us all to continue to hold on to that sacredness of these places, and to also have the faith in God and God's Spirit to help us continue to make the choices to help mitigate and adapt to climate changes. Next week, we will have some opportunities to look at solutions and changes and things that we may be doing and what campgrounds may already be doing. You may already be engaged in some changes. But now we would like to take a few minutes just to listen to some of your concerns, things that you have observed, or threats that your campground is already experiencing. And some of the campgrounds that were mentioned may already be the ones that you attend. So we'll open up for a few minutes for how are you seeing the climate crisis impacting your sacred space, your campgrounds? And I also invite you, if you don't feel comfortable sharing verbally, you can also add it to the chat feature in Zoom. Kathy?
So I'll just say that my primary campground is Samish. And so that's been described. And at a recent event during our reunion that Dean White presented at, he presented this concept of the water taking over our campgrounds, essentially. And we have definitely been impacted by wildfires, not even if they were close to us, but the smoke from those wildfires have been made it very impossible to be outside or breathe or whatever. So it's a very big concern. I can see that we cannot control the impacts of climate change and how they may make our campgrounds unusable.
Thank you, Kathy.
Elizabeth says Deer Haven in Florida has been flooding regularly. Labor Day reunion was canceled.
So yes, that's showing already the impact of changes. Others that have observed or know of what may be some possible impacts of their campground.
This is Harold Lastly.
Hi, Harold.
In the Portland area. Our campground is Lewis River. And I don't know that we've really done an assessment of the impact of climate change to the tree canopy at this time. That is certainly something that I intend to bring forward to the board. But one of the things that I think has also been a concern of mine, I've done some thinking about, is how our activities and the way we transport ourselves to and from the campgrounds and the energy that we use while we're on the campgrounds, how that contributes to climate change. And I think that's something that we also need to be looking at, even as we're looking at the effects of climate change on the environment of the campground itself, in that there are ways that we can mitigate our own carbon footprint, and we need to take advantage of every opportunity we can to do that, and start planning to do that as soon as possible.
Thank you, Harold. Yes, that how many people drive individually or just with another person to a reunion or a campground? Are there ways of finding better solutions to, like you say, reducing our carbon footprint in the transportation to and from? So thank you, Harold, for lifting that up.
Sharon McLean had her hand waving a minute ago.
Yeah, Sharon.
Oh, I'm going to have to unmute myself. Am I unmuted?
Oh, you're unmuted.
Yes.
You're good. Thank you, Sharon.
Okay. I was just going to say that the dryness at Buckhorn has really impacted us in so many ways. Like Paul said, the bark beetle, the fires, but also we just had a big summer storm on the campground that destroyed, pulled down some trees, destroyed some tents that we had up. Those things are getting worse. The storms are. They're heavier, they're faster, they seem to be more destructive, and they come up almost overnight. not often, but when they do, it's a traumatic experience. It just pulled people right off their feet who were trying to hang on to the tents to save them.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon.
So some reports in the chats.
Yeah, thank you, Susan.
Hurricane damage at Bluff Springs in Northwest Florida was mentioned by Marcia. Kathy mentioned that some or most of our campgrounds are on septic systems. Those can be easily overwhelmed, also making the grounds suddenly uninhabitable. Talitha Pennington says, I'm not sure it was a climate cause, but Sanford in Michigan was on Lake Sanford. A dam upstream broke and the lake completely drained away.
Thank you for those comments and observations. The other thing that in Joan's presentation of looking at kind of taking, we look at the campgrounds from a particular viewpoint, and yet they're interconnected with the larger whole. So as Joan was talking about the boreal forest, and Dean and Paul raising things like the pine bark beetle that is destroying forests. Our campgrounds and our sacred spaces, even our churches and our homes, they're a part of that interconnection. So we may say we're focusing on, rise of sea level at Samish, yet there's other things that are happening at Samish due to other things that are happening globally. So that's another thing of looking at the larger whole and how can our campgrounds, and this is a question for us next week to explore, is how can our campgrounds become kind of ecological sanctuaries and places of mitigation to help with some of the climate change and climate crisis things that are happening. So that's a question I want you to ponder and think about, is what are the things that we have the power to do, we have the ability to do. We are maybe a small church, but we still have, 250,000 people around the world. And we also have a strong faith and hope. So those are things I want you to kind of think about for next week of what can we do? What can we be a part of? Are there other observations or things that you have seen that your campgrounds and sacred places have been changing?
Vonda reports that Erie Beach Campground on Lake Erie has been losing property to the lake for years.
Mm-hmm.
While the grounds installed groins, is that the right word, into the lake years ago, property to the east of the grounds has been lost to the lake, with the road closed this year. I will just add that not more than about 10 summers ago, I was at Erie Beach, and they showed me where the sanctuary used to reside on Erie Beach, and the water was already over where those foundations had been built at that time, and there had been a long wharf that went out into the lake that had been totally destroyed by wind and waves and weather as they lost ground. And so they've had to move the camp further and further inland as the lake has eroded things away. I want to just mention that the Great Lakes are a very complex water system that have been studied for years as they've tried to identify the interplay of water coming in, going out, climate, and all of that. And it's extremely difficult for predictions to be made for the Great Lakes systems.
Thank you, Susan and Vonda, for those comments about the Great Lake area and the campground there. I was also thinking about some of our historical and sacred places. Nauvoo, for example, on the Mississippi River, and how that will be impacted. And of course, we have other historical places as well. Any others that of your campground?
Two
Kathy?
things.
Yes, Nancy.
One, we had to forego swimming and baptism this summer because of red tides. And I think the way in which the oceans are being impacted by the warming of climate change, also we need to pay attention to that and how much warmth the ocean absorbs and how that changes the ecology. The other was, I think in some areas, there's some land subsistence as well. I don't know if the Great Lakes are experiencing that, but some of the, both extracting too much water from under the earth, and that would not be Great Lakes, but also fracking and those kinds of things have changed and caused the land to sink. And that creates more problems with certain areas flooding.
Thank you, Nancy.
Kathy says, in the short term, some of our campgrounds could be used as emergency centers for those evacuating wildfires or other disasters. That takes advanced planning with the Red Cross and an emergency plan that could ensure food service.
And I think that's a wonderful idea of how do we adapt and plan for the future, knowing that climate change is coming, it is affecting, it's here, it's doing things. So we will have particular campgrounds that could be safe havens, sanctuary for not just our members, but for the whole community. So thank you, Kathy, for lifting that up. So we just have about another minute or so. Any other comments or observations?
I'm from Whispering
Judy.
Pines, and in Arizona. And this summer we were within 2 miles of a forest fire. I think it got that close to our campground and were evacuated for quite a while. But that didn't impact us financially because our dining hall burned down last summer. And so we were trying to rebuild. So we didn't have anybody on the grounds except our caretaker. But she was evacuated. And during that time, of course, it halted our reconstruction. But during that time, the Forest Service used our parking lot for their camps and their vehicles, and they actually paid us for it. We were very surprised when we got that money, but of course we didn't turn it down. But I do think that we need to be I love that we're doing this because I think we need to be in constant cooperation with them and all of those people working to save the forest.
Thank you, Judy, so much for mentioning that as well. And because particularly, the fires and the Forest Service teams, the smoke jumpers, they need bases of operation. And I think that is also one of those things that kind of goes with that sense of sanctuary, that sense of opening our community to help aid those who are trying to fight fires and to help evacuate people. So I appreciate that very much. And I thank you all for the comments you have shared. And as we going to shift gears here, but think about for next week we have identified some of those crises and some of the things, the threats to our sacred places. And as a community, how can we help be a part of the mitigation, the adoption or adaptation, and the sense of a broader hope to ourselves, but our larger communities where these sacred places reside? And how can we be in the forefront of helping this transition for all of humanity, all of creation, as we begin to experience more and more of how the climate crisis is impacting life in God's holy creation. Thank you. Turn it over to Lori.
Well, bring up my PowerPoint, and can you all see that? Back to this same picture where we began, this picture from Samish Island, which is a place that's special to so many. But it is also the case that the whole world is sacred, right? We have chosen to focus on our campgrounds as a way of trying to bring the impacts of climate change home, because these are places on the earth that really we love and that love us. But that sacredness is everywhere. And for each of us, there are campgrounds. There's also our congregational spaces. There's our homes. There's the park down the street. And I know as I walk with the information that I have, kind of keep leaning, looking at this climate change piece, I found this quote that just speaks to, I could have said this, just speaks to my heart. It has become a constant question for me. Every time I'm entranced by the beauty of this world, what does it mean to love this place? What does it mean to us to love these places that are so sacred to us and to many others? What does it mean to love anyone or anything in a world whose vanishing is accelerating, perhaps beyond our capacity to save some of the things that we love the most? I was walking just this morning and looking at, after a very smoky week and a little bit of rain last night, looking at all the moss on the rocks as I walked, and yet I can't walk without being aware that all of this is endangered. And so I have to admit that I can be a little subject to this, tempted, let me say, to despair. And this same woman, Emily Johnston, who is part of 350 Seattle's climate action group, says despair is an accurate reflection of the peril we face, but it is not a predictor of the future. It's nearsighted, she says. To see beyond what despair sees, to move beyond some of these feelings that sometimes trap us and keep us paralyzed from acting and mitigating and adapting towards new possibilities, calls for things we have in abundance: love, imagination, and a willingness to simply tend the world as best we can without any guarantee of success. So I want to return really quickly to these first 2 points, just to recognize that this is the way we've laid these 2 webinars out to be part of each other. So today, I actually want to, I feel like I want to commend myself as well as you, as all of you. So it's, we're all in this together, for being willing to just even take and dip our toe in the water of coming face to face with realities that we really don't want to have to deal with. But then the second piece is that we are invited to envision an alternative future in harmony with God's nature and purposes for creation. And that envisioning of the future we want, God's preferred future, sometimes we call it, becomes a motivation, and it becomes a way of creating insight about what we might do. So I want to come back to this place of imagination next week, and I want to tell you a story. And I want to tell you, I'm just going to introduce this story. We're going to go into this in a lot more detail next week. But this story has captured my imagination, and we're hoping that it might serve to help fire your imaginations as we consider next week how we might not only protect our sacred spaces, but also how we might imagine and envision future use of these beloved places. So consider this like a little trailer. I'm going to tell you this story, but you're going to see a beautiful film about this, thing that's happening in another place in the world next week. And consider it as a hook or a plea for you to come back and attend. We need your imagination to come together as we consider our sacred spaces. So here's the plot. 100 years ago, in the highlands of North Ethiopia, the land was covered by continuous tracts of old growth forest just 100 years ago. It was reasonably pristine and rich in biodiversity. Today, that landscape is described as a dry hinterland, an arid, degraded patchwork of agricultural fields struggling to support an expanded population. Those forests are gone. Only 3% of the original forest cover remains, which is actually about how much original old growth forest remains in the continental United States. Now, our story is going to tap into the wisdom of the 1600-year-old Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Christian sect. And in the film we see next week, we will meet a man, a very special man, Alimeyahu Wasi. He's an indigenous forest ecologist and also perhaps a bit of a mystic himself. As a student, when he was beginning his research, he came to this startling realization. The remaining fragments of forest in Ethiopia, the only reason that 3% remains is because they're located in small patches around the Ethiopian Orthodox churches. And so you see in this picture from the Emergence website, Emergence magazine, a wonderful story about the church forests of Ethiopia. And we will be watching the film from this next week and really want to invite you to come. So here's what is true about all of this. These remaining fragments of forests are all located in small patches, most of them less than 25 acres, around these churches. They are scattered, he says, like emerald pearls across the brown, excuse me, I want to say this better, scattered like emerald pearls across the brown sea of farm fields. So you can see in this picture and I really do recommend this website and this story. I'm going to give you so that you can actually check it out this week if you'd like. So here's the power of religious imagination. Why have these forests survived? Even these little seed patches, these little scattered like emerald pearls across this dry landscape that's been denuded. Well, there are some utilitarian answers to that question, but here's how the priests would answer it. First, in this ancient expression of Christian faith that is rooted in the land and steeped in its Jewish heritage, a church should always be for them a symbol of paradise. In other words, as you'll hear next week, a church should resemble and remind people of the Garden of Eden. And of course, in Genesis and in the Garden of Eden, that's the place where God said of the earth that we as humans should keep it and dress it. These barren places need to be redressed. Second, in the Ethiopian Orthodox cosmology, these forests are home to invisible hermits called monogam. And it is believed, and there are signs of men who have gone into the forest, only the most holy ones become invisible, but there are signs of ascetic monks living in some of these forests. And the forests are protected because of the fact that contemplative prayer, the quiet work of intercession for healing the entire world is going on in these forests. And they were originally kept from being taken down because they were places of prayer. Fred Manson, who wrote this article, says, these hermits hide themselves not to escape society, but to pray for the healing of the world. And for that work, they are revered. And because of those prayers for the healing of the world, these forests remain, these little patchworks of forests. Third, more recently, a biblical image has also been coming into vivid relief. about how because these forest fragments house all the remaining biodiversity of this once thriving forest ecosystem. Some church forests contain as many as 48 endemic tree species. That means tree species that wouldn't grow anywhere else in the world. And all of the wildlife that depend on those trees. These church forests have literally become like Noah's Ark, keeping alive the creatures who once roamed this entire region. Being kept alive in an ark of biodiversity until one day in the far, far future, beyond these times we live in of catastrophic losses, they might once again thrive in a regenerated ecosystem. Now, we're going to talk more next week. I don't want to take too much time about how it is that 40 of these sites have been targeted to be preserved and protected because they are also degrading, and how the priests themselves have come up with solutions to expand the sacred space. So you'll notice in this picture, the little red and yellow and blue roof is the roof of the actual church. That's done in concentric circles. Beyond that, there are circles of an inner wall. Beyond that was the forest, and these priests said, let's keep expanding the sacred space and create a wall that protects the outer boundaries of the forest from cattle grazing and misuse. So 14 of those 40 forests have been saved so far. 2 of them have already had to expand their walls because the forest started to regrow, seedlings started to be able to take root, sprouts started to be able to come up, birds started coming back, pollinators increase, which helps everybody in the agricultural endeavors around. And they've already expanded the walls, and there's 20,000 of these little tiny fragments of sacred space. And here's the vision. The vision is of Ali Meyahu Wasi, this amazing ecologist that you'll see in the film next week. His vision is that by the time he's an old man, that 40% of the forest can be reestablished. But without the church, without the sacred space being tended out of a heart of religious imagination and deep spirituality, these last little seed possibilities for regenerating these forests through probably millennia, it will take a long time, but the possibility exists because of how the sacred space in Ethiopia around these churches has been tended and cared for and dressed to provide for ecological restoration and the possibility of healing the world. So I am inviting you, urging you to come next week. We're going to watch the film. But in the meantime, and this is the sort of the concluding piece, this is an inner vision that ripples outward, this use of sacred space, stretching our awareness of the holy in ever expanding circles until the whole world might fit inside of it. So here's the question we want you to take away. I added a little bit to it. How might our sacred spaces become centers of world healing prayer, not just prayer, but world healing acts of reverence, things that centers from which we might pray our way into choices and actions that will heal the world? How might our sacred spaces become centers of cultural renewal? How might they become centers of ecological restoration? Now, mind you, I'm not suggesting a literal, I'm not suggesting a literal replication of what's happening in Ethiopia, but we want this to spark our imaginations, our religious imaginations, to say, yes, here are the actions we need to take to adapt and to mitigate, to help folks with climate change. But beyond that, what's the broader vision? We have these resources like jewels. What's the broader vision? And so we would really like you to think about that through this week and come and just start asking yourself, what would the world I want to have after I'm gone look like? What might that look like? So we live, I want to go back to Emily Johnson really quickly as I wrap this up. We live in extraordinary times. The choices we make and the actions we take really, really matter. We may or may not see the fruits of those, but we do know that as we bring our choices and our actions into relationship with other people's choices and actions, as we become communities working together, something new might emerge. Elizabeth Johnston says, we have also been granted an astonishingly beautiful gift that has never before been given to humans, the chance to shepherd human and animal life into the coming centuries and millennia. To do it at a time when we know that much of it would otherwise disappear and may yet disappear. That's a power that should make us very humble, and a privilege that can motivate us profoundly. We still have the chance to make the space for hope for future generations, even if in our generations, we are going to be looking at these realities that are so difficult for us to face. So you were invited next week. Climate Impacts in Sacred Space Part 2. Having considered the impacts of climate change on these campgrounds as we have today, we're going to come back to these same places and look at the ways in which certain solutions might be happening, look towards some indigenous wisdom that's on the horizon, explore possibilities for new missional things that we haven't even thought about yet. So again, I commend this question to you. How might all our sacred spaces, especially our campgrounds, but all the places that you love and that are being impacted by climate change, how might all of our sacred spaces become centers for ecological restoration and cultural renewal? And there you have it. Oh, yeah. So I really do, if you go to that website and that story from Emergence magazine, you will see some beautiful photographs of 360 views of these forests and how they're breathing new life. And it's a really exciting story. I just glossed over it, but it's a podcast and story that's worth doing some homework on. But if you don't get a chance, we're going to do more with it next week. And it's 3:30.